Good morning again, and thank you, Olivier, very much for asking me to speak to you this morning. You collectively in this room are such a critical group of people. You're one of the most important industry groups, quite simply, that will determine whether we actually survive the twin challenges of the climate emergency and biodiversity loss, which is a fairly stark thought, really, for an early morning. Whether, in fact, the lack of food is going to become a major source of instability, threatening and undermining civilizations, or whether we can avert it. Whether or not the food and the farming industry is actually going to carry on depleting the natural systems on which you and we depend and emit growing amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, or whether you can in fact shift at very high speed towards net zero and towards working genuinely in harmony with our wider ecosystems. Now, that's very scary, but this is a near-term risk. It's not some long-term fanciful scenario. And no doubt many European newspapers have enjoyed covering the fact that just 2 weeks ago in the UK, British supermarkets started rationing food, which is an extraordinary thing. It limits the amount of some fresh fruits and vegetables that we could buy. The shelves are actually still empty as I left yesterday. Extreme weather in key growing areas in southern Spain and in northern Africa damaged huge amounts of produce. UK growers simply could not afford the input costs to carry on growing those same vegetables under glass over the winter. And the escalating costs for farmers, you will all know about, but just to give you one data point, in the UK, ammonium nitrate was £234 per tonne in January 2020. It reached a high of £841 per tonne in July last year, and it was still at £700 a tonne in January, just a month ago. So that's an additional £78 million per month for British farmers, according to analysis by the ECIU. So a lack of some fruit and vegetables for a few weeks, in its own right, it's a temporary inconvenience, but it's a big chunk of lost income for scores of farmers. And it's crucially, this is the real point, this is just a small taste, pardon the pun, of what is to come with food markets. I think the thing it's really underlined is there is almost no resilience in the food chains that we have at the moment, and that's why we suffered. As the co-CEO of DSM, Geraldine Matchett, said, when food fails, everything fails. We must work to transform our food systems to be resilient and sustainable and healthy, and I couldn't agree more with her. I must admit, and I work permanently in the broad field of sustainability, not just in food and farming, but I am really worried about the ability of this collective industry that you all represent here today to transform at the pace that we need. Since COP10 in Japan in 2010, precisely none of the targets have been met by any of the signatories. COP15 in Montreal, yes, good, a biodiversity framework. It had some meaningful, if very broad, goals and targets, but intentionally misquote Greta Thunberg. Enough of the blah, blah. We must move from the blah, blah urgently to action. And I'm going to talk about how you move to action in the rest of my speech. Now, it's not all gloom and doom. In fact, there's lots of good news. There are lots and lots of solutions available. It's not as if it's the start of COVID where nobody understands the problem and, more importantly, we don't understand the solutions. Actually, there are loads of solutions available. Many of you in this room are involved in developing them, which is fantastic. Innovations in plant-based alternatives to meat, in drought and flood-resilient seeds, in methane-reducing cattle feed, in regenerative farming principles, vertical farming, hydroponics, I could go on. They're just a few examples of a really vibrant and very fast-growing sector in the wider food and farming industry. And there are increasing number of rewilding projects and nature-based solutions to the damaging mistakes of our past. One of my personal favourites is the reintroduction of beavers to slow the speed of watercourses and to minimize flood risks downstream. Crucially, many of these solutions are actually better for human life and, of course, the wider life of our ecosystems and planet. But there are some really important choices to be made. Choices is such a key word here. There are risks to be taken. There are moves to be made as part of an enormous, highly complex system that no one actor, however big they are, can control. And there is no time. Change now needs to happen at lightning speed if we're to avoid crisis. So, while of course at some level there's a technical challenge, there are markets challenges, there's a policy and regulatory challenge, and of course there's a financial challenge. Above everything else, this is a leadership challenge, which is why I was so delighted to be invited here today to talk to a room full of industry leaders, to share the experiences on leadership and the qualities that, in my experience, I have found are absolutely essential to meeting the kind of extraordinary challenge that collectively we face. So I'm going to touch briefly, very briefly, on climate and nature issues. And many of you will know much of this, but the human brain is incredibly good at putting uncomfortable truths into a box and really not confronting them very often. But we need, and I've found this very much in my work, we need to keep reminding ourselves of the imperative to act, and we need to look at the science. And the stark fact is that despite a historic agreement in Paris over 7 years ago, levels of emission continue to rise with very terrifying consequences unless we address them quickly. So I'd like to play you just a very short video on the latest science. If we can play the video, please.
We can look toward the future, and these are the projections from climate models. And a lot of people may question them, but climate models are bloody good at getting global average temperature. In fact, they're spot on because we understand the physics of the climate system really, really well. Where are we going now? We're going on the orange one. And that's going toward a 4-degree temperature rise by the end of this century compared to pre-industrial. Any idea what the temperature difference is between the last ice age and the present? Any guesses? 4 degrees. So we're talking about a shift as big as between an ice age when mastodons and woolly mammoths were around and humans barely survived. We're talking about the same difference, but not in 5,000 years in 1 century. So let me put that change on the same time frame that I just showed you. There's our 2,000-year history where we developed our cities, modern civilization. There's the spike at the end where we are now. And there's the projections on the same time frame at 2100. Okay? The problem there is that, in my view, it is impossible to survive that sort of change. That's beyond human physiology to deal with that sort of change. In fact, large mammals as a whole will not be very good in that. Our cities are designed for that wavy black line. And remember, a lot of our infrastructure is designed for 100 years. That is 100 years. In fact, that 5 to 6 degrees is business as usual 85 years from now, a human lifetime. So let me just leave you then with a couple of numbers here. That's what we're committed to, by the way. Even with the fastest rollout we can of solar, of non-carbon transport, of different agriculture, we're committed to pretty much 2 degrees. We're not going to make the Paris 1.5. That's already out of the question. And that's already a big shock. But that is where the trajectory we're on now. And that's a collapse scenario, no matter what we do with all the whiz-bang technology, because physiologically we can't survive it. So the real challenge is we've got to make sure we hit that 2 degrees.
So I don't know how much news that was for any of you, but I think it's a stark reminder that as we talk about the detail of our everyday lives, we lift our heads up as leaders and we understand we've got 85 years. And in fact, we haven't really got that. We've got about 10 to start to make a really significant, dramatic shift. So we're facing existential threat. It will be unsurvivable. I can give you a whole load of data points. You will probably know most, if not all of them. But I think this suffices really to underline how perilous the situation is. And of course, for the next 20 years of that, we're looking at significant population increase, and they estimate about another 2 billion mouths to feed, which is obviously crucial in the context of your industry. So I want to touch then on the case for change for food and farming systems. There was a WEF report produced jointly with Bain. It came out in January this year. It estimates that food and agriculture account for over 80% of deforestation and biodiversity loss, over 80%. And it also estimates that about 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions are the responsibility of this industry. That you already produce enough food to nourish more than 10 billion people, significantly more than we have now on the planet, but that about 1/3 is wasted. And that if the global beef and dairy industry were a country, they would rank only 3rd behind China and the US in global emissions. Now, I know those are stark facts, but of course that is my point. So I hope all of you will agree with me, and indeed pretty much all the leading authorities in this area, that our current food system is broken. It is simply not fit for purpose when you look at it in that light. And crucially, against the background that I have described, iterative change is not going to solve the problem in time. That's such an important thing to really focus on. What we need is transformational change. Now, I know this is a phrase that's bandied about. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think that needs. Critically, it needs a roadmap. There isn't one at the moment. That roadmap has to encourage really highly effective farmer-led enterprise. It needs to attract enormously more long-term focused finance, blended finance, with far more capital than is flowing at the moment. And there are several other high-level requirements. The Commission, I know, is working now on a framework for a sustainable food system, but there is no time for delay. This room is full of experts who understand those policy and technical challenges better than I ever will. But this isn't really what I'm here to talk to you about today. My main message to you is very simple. Delivering on this challenge is overwhelmingly a leadership challenge. So at Unilever, as I increasingly have realized since I left, and you look back, was about a decade ahead of many other global corporates in our sustainability goals. We had a new CEO arrive in 2010, Paul Polman, and he had a very bold vision about how to transform the business and hopefully be an exemplar that would create followership for other major corporates. There were very few precedents that we could learn from as a result. And so not surprisingly, we had some successes, but we had some failures as well, and very many painful lessons. Some of these were practical, some of the financial, some were technical, but the most fundamental lessons that we learned were actually about leadership, both across the company, but also outside it. So I was responsible for leading this huge business transformation across 400 brands and 180 countries for several years. And what I want to share with you is what I learned are the key leadership values and behaviors that are needed to drive transformational change in a complex system. I'd also add that since I left Unilever, in my work, amongst other things, I tutor at Cambridge University, which has a sustainability institute for leadership. So I've had the privilege to tutor over 200 C-suite leaders. And what I found is these principles apply no matter what business you're in, whether it's big or small, and whether it's public or privately owned. And I group these headings into 3. The first is mindset and values. The second is strategy and goals. And the third is networks and collaboration. So let me expand briefly on each of these. Firstly, mindset and values. There are 4. That's 5. There are 4 leadership characteristics under this heading. Boldness and risk-taking are the first and absolutely essential leadership characteristics. The progress that we need at the speed we need it at is quite simply impossible without them. So if you are not a leader who will make bold judgments, take calculated risks, and do all that without the data that you normally rely on to guide you, then honestly, you need to move out of the way for someone who will. Highest common denominator thinking. That's a bit of a mouthful. Apologies for those who are not English speakers. This is the second essential mindset. So much of our thinking in our professional lives is binary. It's winners versus losers. It's gains versus losses. It's, do we deliver returns for the short term, or do we do the right thing for the longer term? We very rarely really work at this and try and find the time to identify how you avoid the trade-offs and how that becomes lowest common denominator. But it is possible, not all the time, but a huge amount of the time. If we continue on this path, we will not achieve the transformational change that we need. Thirdly, I found that you have to have your own deeply personal moral compass to guide you and to keep you on the right path, because you will all know, just the few conversations I've had fleetingly this morning reconfirm, we have so many competing and compelling interests that we have to try and chart a way through what the conflict and the pressures are. And then a fourth is that without a deep belief and understanding in the moral case, you've seen the video from Professor Stefan, it is inevitable that you will get pushed and buffeted off course. So that's mindset and values. Second, strategy and goals. So I've talked about the moral case. It's absolutely essential, both at a corporate level and a personal level. But the moral case will not get you there. It is not enough. I could list you numerous companies who, when they understand the science, they appreciate the economy as a wholly owned subsidiary of the biosphere, not the other way around. They become zealous about the case for change, and then they struggle a bit and they make poor progress and they get disheartened. Well, why? The answer is very simple. The answer is that the moral case has to be married with a clear business case. Now, developing a business case is very difficult, even in a normal run of things in a business. In this situation, it's extremely challenging because you won't have the data that you need. But that shouldn't stop you applying your judgment. And your judgment needs to be applied to 4 very simple questions, no matter where you sit in the sector. The first, which a lot of people come to last, but you should put first, is, will this drive the right kind of growth? Growth is the engine still for our economy. It's the engine for business. It's what gets people out of bed every day. And it's what's needed to generate the funds for investment to get to the future that we need. So will it drive the right kind of growth? Will it mitigate risk? Will it help us manage our costs for the long term? And will it build trust, license to operate, growth, risk, cost, trust? And until we have leaders as a generalization who can make those kinds of judgments, and as a result, who will treat sustainability as a core element of business strategy, I can name almost no companies that can do that at that level at the moment, we will continue to see the kind of unhealthy trade-offs that I've talked about that lead to short-term profits trumping everything else. Be absolutely clear, we will not get near the transformational change that we need unless we make this shift. That business case, in turn, then, has to set really stretching goals. The sorts of goals that drive and force a step change and transformational level of solutions. My mantra on this is very simple. If you're not scared about whether you're going to achieve those targets, you're not doing it right. So ask yourself, all of you who set targets, how scared am I? If you're comfortable, go back and look at them again. And that goal, finally, must not get in the way of action. We're really good at wanting everything to be linear, aren't we? You can't be. We haven't got the time. We have to juggle things in a different way. You need to show a bias for action, knowing that a solution is directionally right, recognizing you're going to need to learn and adapt along the way, but not letting a desire for perfection slow you down. So the third heading, which is networks and collaboration. Normally, achieving system change is very slow and it's very complicated. As I mentioned earlier, it really needs some form of roadmap, and a roadmap where every actor can see what they're working to, however imperfect that roadmap is. Effective policy, of course, is absolutely critical here. That needs to be built in a completely collaborative way, looking at the full system, but crucially, not distorted by the lobbying that comes with narrow self-interest. And it needs to drive all actors to level up. That framework and that policy framework needs to create an environment where the markets can really work, because we need the markets to drive change. But we also are going to have to be able to be collaborative in the way in which we do that. But markets have to be encouraged and incentivized to solve the problem. Now, that will require new ways of working and new networks. You need to build across silos, and crucially, you are going to need to work with organizations that you currently compete with. Building partnerships with others who are basically working to the same goal as you, but have a different and complementary knowledge or skills. People who can bring critical mass, this is a crucial point, to help a new market or a new solution overtake and replace the old model. And they get to affordability at scale more quickly. It's very alien, I know this, for many of us who've worked in business for a long time, to think about collaborating with our competitors. And of course, there has to be a legal space where this can happen. All that's achievable. But transformation basically needs as much alignment and market readiness and scaling as quickly as possible in order to succeed. I want to talk to you just very briefly about two examples that I've been involved in that will bring this to life. And the first is a story about Primark, which is one of the three big fast fashion retailers in the UK and Europe. So I led the process with their leadership team to develop their first sustainability strategy in 2020. Yes, in the middle of COVID. You may wonder why I'm telling you here about a clothing company, not a food or crop company. It's because over 60% of their clothing is made from cotton, a crop which I'm sure many of you will know requires very high level of pesticides. It's very water hungry. It depletes soil quality. And of course, it competes with food for land use. Apart from that, it's fabulous. It was clear to us, not surprisingly, that cotton supplies were going to come under threat given that cocktail, and that the risk would be significantly reduced by working with the cotton industry and with farmers to try and shift to regenerative farming practices. But the concept was full of hurdles. At that point, there was no published regenerative cotton farming code that we could find. There were no industry agreed figures on impact and outcome. There was no reliable, proven supply at scale to the organic alternatives to pesticides. The impact on crop yield, completely unknown. The impact on farmer income, completely unknown. All really good reasons to go, well, we can't make this commitment until we know a lot more. But to the credit of the Primark leadership team, bearing in mind they were new to this, it's not as if they've been deep into sustainability for many years. They recognized that a shift in farming practices would be essential to their business. So they committed to, and they made public, a target to source 100% their cotton from regeneratively grown sources by 2030. They did this without knowing if or how it could be achieved. Instead, they trusted that making a bold ambition widely known would attract partners that would help them in terms of technical knowledge, the ability to do pilots, and so on and so forth. And crucially, to be able to trace the cotton that was grown. And this last piece is really essential from a commercial point of view, not just risk management, but also so that you can make product claims that consumers can see and trust. Remember my first point, growth. Okay. Since Primark published that ambition, they have been working with partners to do pilots. They're now about to publish a workable definition of regenerative cotton farming practice, and that is going to do what people said couldn't be done. It's going to both improve soil health, It's going to improve farmer income, and it's going to provide a stable supply of the right quality cotton, and one where traceability is possible.
Be fairly brief now. We want time for a couple of questions, and we are running over a bit.
My second very brief story is about Unilever and palm oil, where palm oil was an enormous crop. It was the largest buyer of palm oil in the world, but it still only bought 5%. You will all know the problems with palm oil as a crop. It was very obvious, again, that there needed to be a shift. And so this is back in 2010, we made a public commitment to source all palm oil from sustainable sources by 2020. And this required a complete change in the style of operation. It required helping set up and create a round table. It involved developing new techniques for how one could trace this. It involved creating a system of incentives for farmers, smallholder farmers, to shift. Suffice to say that not all of that worked. And so 5 years in, it was under constant review, but there was a very big review. And that led to even deeper involvement, where we could look at what was happening in the link between the individual farmer and the mill, because until then, no system existed where you could trace right back to the very source. And you might ask, why did we set a 100% target when there was so little prospect of meeting it? And the answer is very simple, because we knew that everybody would stake a claim to be part of that percentage that was exempted. It would create a diversionary effort where what we needed was all efforts on doing something revolutionary and new. And did we succeed? Not quite. But by the end of 2021, 90% of all palm oil bought by Unilever, the world's biggest buyer, was bought and proven certified sustainable sources. And a simply extraordinary achievement given where we started in 2010, but also a good example of the kind of timescales. So to conclude quickly, I just want to underline that the people in this room are really critical guardians of our planet, and that your whole industry depends on the health of our natural world, and that your roots, more than any other industry, are deep in our countryside, in our wildlife, in our pollinators and our forests and our rivers and our oceans. And that you are responsible for leading the food and the farming industry to greater productivity, for better, healthier diets and lives, and for achieving all this whilst also helping to restore nature. And it's managing that tension that's so fundamental. And I know it's very difficult to envisage that when we look at the state of things, with farmers struggling to afford input costs, with literally millions of consumers across this continent and more widely having to choose between whether they heat their homes or feed their families on a daily basis. But I think you need to take what's happening now as a prompt to avoid an escalating crisis. Don't let the short term put off real bold decision making around managing for the long term. Because in the words of Charles Darwin, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent. It's the one that's most adaptable to change. And that, ladies and gentlemen, has to be us. So I hope I've slightly strengthened your resolve for the mission to bring around transformational change in our food and farming systems. And I hope I've given you at least some useful food for thought on the essential leadership qualities that you all will need to demonstrate. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sue. Thank you. We have, so setting out there, please, very starkly, what is at stake, what we need to do, and how we need to do it. We literally have a couple of minutes left. So I have one question in writing, but if anyone in the room has a burning question, I will squeeze it in. Now, no, it's fine. I want to do it. Thank you. Anybody? No? Very quick one, if you would.
Max Schulman, representing the farmers in the room. How do you fit the legislators and the politicians into that box?
So this is not to dodge the question. I'm not a policymaker working in this field at the moment. I would say a few things to you. First of all, the people that are going to get us out of this mess will be the farmers and the markets. There is no other system where the money will go, where the solutions sit, and the innovation will happen, and the practice will get delivered on the ground. The worst thing anybody can do that's involved in being part of that market solution is to wait for regulatory perfection, because it's an illusion. In any sector, never in my civil service career did I ever see policy perfection. What you do need is you need the principles of a roadmap that everybody can see, however imperfect, is going to set a clear direction for the future. Because what markets need more than anything else is they need enough clarity, and that means consistent signals from policymakers about what's going to be on and off the table in the future, the principles of where penalties and incentives will sit. And I would say it's impossible, it's literally, in my mind, inconceivable that policymakers can be too bold at the moment. I know they have multiple issues to resolve. I understand all that. I've sat in the middle of government, and it's really like being a wrecking ball where you're smashed from one direction to the other. And that's why I make my point, is that you have to balance the business case and the moral case. But we actually all know. We know the problems we're trying to solve. We know the range of solutions that are available. This is exactly what I was saying at the start. There are some significant areas of uncertainty, but let's face it, we all need to own our own bad. We all need to stop lobbying for short-term self-interest. We need to stop lobbying for things like massive qualification around deforestation, for example. We know the direction the world needs to go in. And this sector is several years behind other really big sectors. So my answer to you is don't look to point fingers at each other. That's my critical point at the end is collaborate, look to the future, think about where the end state is, using the solutions we've got, and encourage policymakers to create that roadmap quickly with some rough edges, but with the right kind of long-term interest. So, no, I'm sure they're not going fast enough. It terrifies me. In 2023, we're still talking about needing a roadmap for this industry. 80% deforestation, I remind you.
We are going to come back on all of these issues over the next 2 days. Sue, thank you so much for giving us such a challenging, thought-provoking, but also inspirational start in terms of what we need to do, but also what we can do. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking Sue very much indeed? Thank you so much.